some happy little place where, you know, someone's feeding you peeled grapes. That isn't what it is. It's more like victory on the honorable battlefield or something like that.
Yeah, the perception that people have of ultimate success and ultimate happiness is, it seems motivated by what they don't have, rather than an understanding of what success and happiness really is. Their idea is that one day I'm going to go and I'm going to be in my golden years and I'm just going to be able to sit around and do nothing and tell everybody to fuck off. You won't be happy at all.
I talked to one of the people that I was working with who had a vision for retirement. I said, well, what's your vision for retirement? Well, I see myself in a beach, you know, some tropical country drinking margaritas. And I thought, first, that's not a plan. That's a travel poster. It's like, okay, let's walk through this. All right, so you go down to this tropical country and you go sit on the beach and you have a margarita. It's like, okay, well, how many margaritas? Like 10? Okay, so you're gonna do that, what, you're gonna do that for 6 months?
You'll be dead.
Yeah, well, you'll be this like pathetic, sunburned, like...
Fat.
Yeah, unhappy, hungover, cirrhotic.
In pain.
Yeah, it's like that's your vision.
Dehydrated.
So how long can you have a margarita on a beach? Like maybe you can do that once every 6 months for like 10 minutes, something like that. It's not a vision.
In today's video, we dive into the concept of finding happiness and success through personal responsibility and meaningful engagement. Dr. Peterson challenges common misconceptions about ultimate happiness and emphasizes the importance of taking control of your life, making a positive impact, and embracing the mundane moments that shape our existence.
It's true, but when you are working and slaving away, you think about that beach with your feet up, and the waiter comes over. Would you like another margarita, Mr. Peterson?
Yeah.
Yes, I would.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're like,
absolutely.
all right,
but
baby.
Right, exactly. But it's like this 16-year-old fantasy of paradise. It's like, well, and it just doesn't work out. So and the thing is that the thing that sustains people through life really is the lifting of a worthwhile burden. It's something like that. Yeah. And it's partly because we're social animals, right? It's like we're evolved to be useful to the people around us because they're much more likely to let us live if we're like that.
Yeah.
So, and it's been very fun especially talking to young men about this. It's like, well, and that's the other thing too, is I think the world is full of darkness, let's say. And we could say each of us have a little bit of light. And if we release that light, if we let it shine properly, Christ, it's too cliched to go on with in some sense, but the world is a lesser place if you do not reveal from within yourself what you have to reveal. And the fact that the world is a lesser place actually turns out not to be trivial. Like if you aren't everything you could be, more people will die, more people will suffer, more evil will be unconstrained, more tyranny will reign, more chaos will remain chaotic and dangerous, all of that.
Do you mean this in the sense of like the old proverb of the wings of a butterfly fluttering become a hurricane?
It's something similar to that, but it can even be more local. It's like your family is more messed up than it could be if you were less messed up than you are.
Right.
So if you just got your act together, like 10% more, your family would be 1% better.
Right.
It's like, well, do it.
And that would ripple off into the people that they interact with.
Yes, and it ripples fast.
Yes.
That's the other thing that's so cool, is that like people think, well, there's 7 billion of us, and each of us is just this separate dust mote, like floating in the cosmos, and what the hell difference does it make what you do anyways? It's like, that is not how we're connected. It's like, you're the center of a network, and you know way more people than this, but let's say typically, you're going to know 1,000 people in your life, well enough to have an impact on them, okay? And each of those 1,000 people is going to know 1,000 people. So you're 1 step from 1 million, and 2 steps from 1 billion. And we are networked, technically. That's how human interactions work. And so when you do something that you shouldn't do, it's worse than you think. And when you do something that you should do, it's better than you think. And so you think, well, this is why I've been telling people, well, clean up your room. It's like, well, your room is actually networked too. It's not that easy to clean up your room, to set it. So you want your room to be set up so that when you walk in there, it tells you to be better than you generally are. It's organized, it's got direction, everything's in its place. You try to do that in a chaotic household. You know, I've watched people do this because I had students do these sorts of things as assignments. I'd say, look, pick a small moral goal, clean up your room, and just write down what happens as a consequence. So maybe these are students in a chaotic household. The whole place is a bloody mess. No one's taking any responsibility for anything. And so they decide they're going to start to clean up their room. And then the people in the household notice. Well, the first thing they do is get pissed off. It's like, who do you think you are? Like, you think you're better than us? Like, why do you think this is worthwhile? Who died and made you God? All of that. So just by trying to organize this little part of their life, they immediately run into the people whose actions they're casting in a dim light by trying to improve themselves to some degree. They might have to have like a thorough war in their household to be allowed to do something as simple as keep the room orderly. They'll find out very rapidly that A, that's way more difficult than it sounds, and B, that the consequences of it are far more far-reaching than people think. So that's quite fun. You know, because maybe part of it is that like everything around you is full of potential. Everything. Maybe more potential than you could ever possibly utilize. And so maybe all you have is this little rat hole of a room in some rundown place in the world. It's like, fix it up. There's more there than you think. See what happens if you fix it up. And you'll fix yourself up simultaneously because you'll have to get disciplined in order to fix up the room. And then you have a fixed up room and you'll be a more fixed up person. It's like, you think that nothing will happen as a consequence of that? It's like all hell will break loose as a consequence of that. It's really worth trying.
It is worth trying, and it's a concept that seems alien to people. But if you think about it, it makes sense.
Well, people don't take what they have right in front of them seriously enough. It's like the wasting time thing. They don't do the arithmetic. You know, and they also don't understand. They devalue what they have right in front of them. Like another client I worked with was having a hard time putting his kid to bed at night. And so we did the arithmetic. It's like, well, I'm fighting with my kid for 45 minutes a night trying to get him to go to bed. Okay, so let's analyze that. All right, so what does that mean? Well, it means that both of you end the day upset. That's not so good, because why would you want that? It means that you're spending 45 minutes fighting when you could spend 20 minutes doing something positive, like reading to him, say. Means that you don't get to spend that time with your wife, so she's not very happy with you, plus you're annoyed because you don't see her, plus you blame it on the kid because he's the proximal cause. It's like, that's pretty damn ugly. And then let's do the arithmetic. It's like 7 days a week, 45 minutes a day. Let's call that 5 hours, 20 hours a week, 240 hours in a year. You're spending a month and a half of work weeks fighting with your 4-year-old son. Think you're going to like him? You don't like anyone you spend a month and a half a year fighting with. It's a bad idea. Fix it. It's important. Get him to bed. Make it peaceful. You do it like these things that repeat every single day. That's a motif in this book too. Your life isn't margaritas on a beach in Jamaica. That happens now and then. Those are exceptions. Your life is how your wife greets you at the door when you come home every day. Because that's like 10 minutes a day. Your life is how you treat each other over the breakfast table. Because that's an hour and a half or an hour every single day. You get those mundane things right, those things you do every day. You concentrate on them and you make them pristine. It's like you got 80% of your life put together. These little things that are right in front of us, they're not little. That's the first thing. They are not little, and they're hard to set right. And if you set them right, it has a rippling effect, and fast too. If someone comes to me and says they're depressed, is ask myself a question. Well, what does this person mean by that? So I have to find out, because maybe they're not depressed, maybe they're hyper anxious, or maybe they're obsessional. Like there's various forms of powerful negative emotion, so they need to be differentiated. But then the next question you have to ask is, well, are you depressed, or do you have a terrible life, or is it some combination of the two? So if you're depressed, as far as I can tell, you don't have a terrible life. You have friends, you have family, you have an intimate relationship, you have a job or a career, you're about as educated as you should be given your intelligence. Use your time outside of work wisely. You're not beholden to alcohol or other temptations. You're engaged in the community in some fundamental sense, and all that's working. Now, if you have all that and you're feeling really awful, you're either ill or you're depressed. And so then sometimes there's a biochemical route to that, treatment of that. My experience has been as a clinician is if you're depressed, but you have a life and you take an antidepressant, it will probably help you a lot. Now, maybe you're not depressed. Exactly. You just have a terrible life.
Building mental toughness is not just about brute force, but a strategic and psychological approach. Are you ready to harness the tools and strategies that will help you overcome any obstacle, face any challenge, and emerge victorious? Then this video is tailor-made just for you. Let's get started. renowned psychologist and best-selling author Bernt Peterson as he reveals the psychological hack to develop unwavering mental resilience. The first step is to check up.
You have no relationship. Your family's a mess. You've got no friends. You've got no plan. You've got no job. You use your time outside of work not only badly but destructively. You have a drug or alcohol habit or some other vice, pornography addiction. You are completely unengaged in the surrounding community. You have no scaffolding whatsoever to support you in your current mode of being or you move forward. And then, as a therapist, well, you do two things. Well, if it's depression per se, well, like I said, there's sometimes a biochemical root, a nutritional root. There's ways that can be addressed. It's probably physiological if you're, at least in part, if you're depressed but you have an okay life. Sometimes it's conceptual. You can turn to dreams, sometimes to help people, because dreams contain the seeds of the potential future. And if your person is a real good dreamer and you can analyze dreams, that can be really helpful. But that seems to be only true for more creative people. And for the people who just have a terrible life, it's like, okay, you have a terrible life. Well, let's pick a front. How about you need a friend, like one sort of friend. And people don't know how to do that. And then they can't even get the ball rolling, and there's these elementary social skills that hypothetically, if you were well cared for, you learned when you were like 3. Yeah. And sometimes I had lots of clients to whom no one ever paid any attention. And they needed like 10,000 hours of attention. And some of that was just listening, because they had 10,000 hours of conversations they never had with anyone. And they were all tangled up in their head. And they had to just, one client in particular, I worked with this person for 15 years. And she wanted for me just to shut the hell up for 50 minutes, which was very hard for me. And to just tell me what had happened to her. And then what happened at the end of the conversation, then I could discuss a bit with her. And then as we progressed through the years, the amount of time that we spent in discussion increased in proportion in these sessions, until by the time we stopped seeing each other, when my clinical practice collapsed, we were talking about 80% of the time. But she'd never been attended to properly, ever. And so she was an uncarved block in the Taoist sense, right? She hadn't been subjected to those flaming swords that separated the wheat from the chaff. And so you can do that in therapy. If you're listening and you're depressed, I would say, if you can't find a therapist, and that's getting harder and harder, because it's actually become illegal to be a therapist now, because you have to agree with your clients, which is a terrible thing to do with them, just like it's terrible just to arbitrarily oppose them. You could do the self-authoring program online, because it helps you write an autobiography. And so if you have memories that are more than 18 months old that bother you when you think them up, part of you is locked inside that. An undeveloped part of you is still trapped in that. That's a metaphorical way of thinking about it. That's why it still has emotional significance. So you can write about your past experiences, but I would say wait for at least 18 months if something bad has happened to you, because otherwise you just hurt yourself again by encountering it. You can bring yourself up to date with an autobiography. There's an analysis of faults and virtues, that's the present authoring, and then there's a guided writing exercise that helps you make a future plan. Young men who do that could go to college. Young men who do that, 90 minutes, just the future authoring, 90 minutes, they're 50% less likely to drop out. That's all it takes. Sometimes it's way worse than that. Like, I had clients who were so depressed they literally couldn't get out of bed. Can you prop yourself up on your elbows once today? Like, you scale back the dragon till you find one that's conquerable, that moves you forward. There's a rubric for life. Scale back the dragons till you find one conquerable. And it'll give you a little bit of goal, commensurate with the struggle. But the plus side of that, because you think that, God, that's depressing. You mean I have to start by sitting up? Well, you do if you can't sit up. But the plus side of that is it's the Pareto distribution issue, is that aggregates exponentially increase. And failures do too, by the way. But aggregates exponentially increase. So once you start the ball rolling, it can get zipping along pretty good. This person that I talked about was incapable of sitting with me in a cafe when we first met, just talking, even though I was her therapist. But by the end, she was doing stand-up comedy. You know, it took years, but still most people won't do stand-up comedy. That's quite the bloody achievement. She would read her poetry on stage too. So for someone who was petrified into paralysis by social anxiety and who had to start very small, it was a hell of an accomplishment. Take on some responsibility. Do something for other people. You're doing something for yourself while you're doing that, even if you don't know it, for sure, because you're a community across time. Find a job, do your best with the customers. Don't be above your job. You're going to get an entry-level job when you're a kid. Well, what else would you want? You want to be the boss? What do you know? You don't know anything. You could be the boss of your job. You know, if you're working in a grocery store, or you're working in a convenience store, assuming you're not working for terrified tyrants, you can be nice to the customers. You can develop your social skills. You can learn how to handle boss-employee relationship. You can be there 15 minutes early and leave 15 minutes late. Like, you can learn in an entry-level job, man. And I'll tell you, if you take an entry-level job and you learn, and it's a reasonably decent place, you will not be in an entry-level job for long. Because everyone who's competent is desperate for competent people. And if you go and show yourself as competent, there'll be a trial period, but if you go show yourself as competent, all sorts of doors you didn't even know were there will start opening like mad.
Take action now and apply what you've learned. Start by assessing your own mental well-being and identifying areas for growth. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life-changing content.
I said in one of the chapters in my books is focused on putting your house in order. It's like, well, how do you start? Make your bed. You know, it actually took me quite a long time in my life before I made my bed regularly in the morning. Most of my life was in pretty good order, but that was one thing I didn't have in order. My clothes in my closet as well, all that's in order. Not all of it. I'm cleaning out some drawers right now, but look around and see what bugs you in your room. Just look. It's like, okay, I'm in my room. Do I like this room? No, it bugs me. Okay, why? Well, the paint's peeling there and it's dusty there and the carpet's dirty and that corner's kind of ugly and the light there isn't very good and my clothes closet's a mess, so I don't even like to open it. Okay, that's a lot of problems. That sucks. That's a lot of opportunity. Pick something and fix it. Pick something that you know would pick a problem. Pick a solution to it that you know would help, that you could do, that you would do. So you have to negotiate with yourself. It's like, well, I won't clean up this room. How do you know? I've been in here for 10 years and I've never cleaned it up. It's like, well, obviously that's too big a dragon for you. Would you clean one drawer? And so imagine now you want to be happy when you open that drawer and you think, well, that's stupid. It's like, is it? Maybe it's your sock drawer, which I cleaned up in my room the other day, by the way. You're gonna open that every morning. So that's like 30 seconds of your life every day. Okay, so that's 3 minutes a week. That's 12 minutes a month. That's 2 hours a year. So maybe your life is made out of, you got 16 hours a day. You got 200 5-minute chunks, and they repeat. A lot of them repeat. So if you get every one of those right, they're trivial, right? Who cares what my sock drawer looks like? It's like, fair enough, man, but that's your life. The things you repeat every day. The mundane things. Think, I could get all those mundane things right. That's the game rules. It's like, now all the mundane is in place. Now you can play, because all the mundane's in place. And this is actually true. So with children, imagine you want your children to play. Well, play is very fragile neurologically. Any competing motivation or emotion will suppress play. So everything has to be in order. Everything has to be a walled garden before the children will play. That's a good way of thinking about it. So you put everything in order and you think, oh my God, now I'm tyrannized by this order. It's like, no, you aren't, not if it's voluntary. And then the order is the precondition for the freedom. And so then all of a sudden you get all these things in order. It's like, oh, look at this, I've got some room to play here. And then maybe you're not depressed. You always want to look at what the consequence of a technological transformation is. And this is a big transformation. You know, there used to be flagship media sources that were basically attempting to give a balanced picture, and I think they did a pretty good job 30 years ago. Time magazine, even the mainstream news programs, they had a professionalism that was associated with their journalism that had some degree of objectivity, and that's fragmented. And it's fragmenting because there's all these media sources, innumerable media sources. And so it's driving people who are trying to get attention to desperation, and they exaggerate the polarity. And so that puts everyone on edge, and Twitter puts people on edge. And this is part of the reason I'm still thinking about what to do with Twitter. Maybe I should not use it for a month, because Twitter, I think, my experience with Twitter is that I'm wandering around in the world and everything's fine. The streets are peaceful. The people I meet are doing well. That your cities, I've been to, I don't know how many American cities in the last 4 months, like 40 or 50. They look great. You know, I mean, everywhere I go, there's construction, and the country feels like it's moving. When I counsel my clinical clients who are depressed or anxious, one of the things I've always told them to do over the last few decades is to disconnect themselves from the news. I realized back in 1985 that news wasn't news. If it was only news for a day, it wasn't important. So I read magazines. You know, I read Harper's, or I'm not at the moment, Harper's, Atlantic Monthly, The Economist. Those were my basic sources for news. Now that's changed, you see, because I got tangled up so badly in scandal 2 years ago that I've been on top of, especially social media, like an obsessed addict for 2 years, trying to manage it. You know, but it's not clear to me that that's been a good thing. Certainly, I don't think Twitter is a good thing for my sanity. Twitter is so contentious. It's so, I mean, if you want a daily dose of hate, you can get it in 10 minutes on Twitter. There's a number of comments about whatever I posted, and 1 out of 4 of them is brutally rude and obnoxious, as nasty as it can possibly be. And that's very, very common. And you know, people are quite sensitive to negative information. We're more sensitive to negative information than we are to positive information. And I'm not complaining. I don't have to use Twitter. It's a completely voluntary choice. And I'm certainly a massive beneficiary of the existence of social media. So I'm not complaining about it. I don't have a right to complain about it. But it exists in absolute contrast to my experiences in the world. Like, it's not like I'm walking down the street and 1 person out of 4 jumps out of an alley and curses me. I haven't had a single negative interaction with an individual. That's not true. I met one really drunk woman in Dublin, and she called me a wanker. But I've had thousands of interactions with individual people on the street, let's say, in airports and so forth, in the last 6 months, and every single one of them has been overwhelmingly positive. So that's reality. Then I go into Twitter and it's like, oh my God, it's just brutal. Well, look, when I was still working as a professor, I'm on unpaid leave at the moment. You know, I get my feedback from my students, and my feedback has been generally extraordinarily positive. So maybe there'll be 50 comments from students, and 3 of them will be negative, something like that, or 2, and often quite nasty, the negative ones. And you remember the negative ones, and that is what people are like. We're much more sensitive to negative, and the reason for that is negative things can kill you. Positive things can make you a little happier. Well, no, look, it's complicated, because my life has gone, I mean, my life was fairly broad 2 years ago. I had a number of businesses, I had my clinical practice, I was working as a professor, I was writing, I was involved in lots of things, and so I had plenty to do. You know, but since then it's gone like this, and some of it's unbelievably good, and some of it's really, really bad, and so the breadth of it has extended. And so, there's no shortage of ridiculously positive things that are happening to me on an ongoing basis. I can't even believe it, but the same is true on the negative end. And so what's happened is the range of my emotional experience has expanded almost unbearably, I would say. So, and again, I'm not complaining about that, because I could choose to do it differently. But some of this has also been a matter of management. It's like, it is literally the case that although it's been a little better over the last 3 or 4 months, for about 18 months in a row, I was at the center of a scandal that could have taken me out at least twice a week. So constant, non-stop scandal of one form or another. And so that took a lot of juggling and management to see what was going on, and I was paying attention to social media and trying to figure out how to respond in the press and on YouTube and on my blog and all of these sorts of things, trying to learn how to do that. And so it's been an obsessive learning experience, let's say. YouTube has served me very, very well. My blog works out very well for me. The podcast, I have a podcast, it's very popular. That's worked out really well. Facebook, I don't pay much attention to Facebook, although I post on it. Twitter, that's something else. Twitter is, I don't know what to do with Twitter. I think I go back and forth. I go back and forth. You know, there's a part of me that there's people I keep up with on Twitter, the people I follow, some of these IDW types, so to speak. You know, I see what Shapiro's posting, I see what Brett Weinstein's posting, and Sam Harris, and I kind of keep in the loop that way. And I feel a moral obligation to keep up. And I have 900,000 followers, and I feel an obligation to them too. But there's also this addictive curiosity, you know, that what's happening? And I tried to pull myself away from that on the TV news, because it's the same thing except in much less concentrated form. And it was good for me. And I do think if it's only important today, it's not important. But I still haven't figured out how to completely deal with all this social reach I have at my fingertips. I don't know exactly how to manage it. In some sense, the online world, and this is the world that the IGN kids are immersed in, it's a faux celebrity world, right? Because everyone online, in some sense, is a celebrity of different proportions. They have their followers, they have their fans, let's say, and then the whole enterprise seems to facilitate image management. I know I think it's TikTok, there are real-time facial feature adjustment filters so that you can girls use them more than boys for obvious reasons. You can make your lips plumper and redder, you can make your eyes bigger, you can anime yourself, you can cutify yourself, to coin a terrible term, and you can do that in real time. And much of the reinforcement pressure seems to be directed towards attention seeking, and then that combined with the fact that there are almost no consequences for misbehavior seems to produce first of all, a toxic social environment, but also one that doesn't follow the same rules as actual face-to-face contact, which I think is the bigger danger. The other thing I'm wondering about too, I've thought about this to a great degree, is that I studied antisocial behavior in boys and girls. And boys, they're pretty much straightforward juvenile delinquents when they're antisocial. They kick and fight and steal and break rules. And it's a lot of externalizing behavior, right? A lot of acting out. But girls who are antisocial, they use reputation destruction and innuendo and gossip and backbiting, and they can be unbelievably good at it. And everyone knows that. I mean, Mean Girls, that famous movie, was about precisely that. And the thing about social media one of the things about it that's quite interesting and disturbing is that female-type antisocial behavior scales brilliantly online, because it can be done behind the scenes, it can be done anonymously, it can be done with that derisive contempt, let's say, and the consequences are vanishingly small. And so I can imagine that teenage girls who are often subject to bullying by other girls are now subject to bullying in a way that's much more subtle and much more devious and much more continuous, because that's the other thing that happens to young people now is, can you imagine being a teenager where nothing you ever did would be forgotten? Well, I remember, we did psychometric analysis and looked at the psychometric analysis of thought patterns that loaded on trait neuroticism. And so, as you know well, but I'll explain to everyone else, trait neuroticism is something like your baseline level of the proclivity to experience negative emotion, like depression and anxiety. And one of the things that's quite striking is that self-conscious thoughts load so heavily on neuroticism, they're almost indistinguishable from emotions. And so it looks like if you're self-conscious, if you're thinking about yourself, you are instantly miserable. And then if you're a then it gets worse for teenage girls, I think, because we also know that teenage girls experience a spike in neuroticism that's attendant on puberty, and that their self-conscious concerns tend to be particularly body-focused. And that's probably a consequence of the fact that females are evaluated more stringently as a consequence of their appearance, particularly when they're young. I mean, men are evaluated on the basis of their performance, let's say, but women tend to be evaluated more on the basis of their appearance. And so you can see that's a perfect storm for young girls, because they hit a negative emotion peak at 13. Now they're susceptible to bullying. They're extremely self-conscious about their bodies. And then the entire online world is a place to display for public. It's like the old nightmare that people have about public speaking, is being naked on a stage. That's really, in some real sense, what the social media world has done to teenage girls. And the reaction I have often is something like when an anonymous troll posts something particularly caustic, I think, if you dared say anything like that to me, to my face, even once, there would be so much trouble surrounding you immediately that you can hardly imagine it. But online, you know, there is this social distancing phenomenon that's well known to social psychologists and personality psychologists, that even if you're in your car and thereby sheltered, let's say, from immediate interpersonal feedback, you're much more likely to act in a self-centered and self-aggrandizing manner because you miss that immediate feedback. And there's absolutely no consequence whatsoever to behaving in a narcissistic and self-centered manner online, as far as I can tell. And then that tends to promote, especially for people who are rather disinhibited to begin with, that promotes a kind of self-aggrandizing narcissism that would be absolutely unthinkable in real life. One of the things that the web does particularly well is capitalize on short-term attentional, well, let's just call it short-term attention, right? It's the next hot thing. It's like, it's the 24-hour news cycle in some sense, broken down into 30-second bits. And you can distract yourself endlessly with those sorts of things. I mean, I'm saying this too, obviously, as a prolific creator of more long-form content, but we use TikTok and Instagram and these shorter forms as well to communicate with. But you can certainly feed yourself on a steady diet of 15 to 30-second clips, and they are engaging in the moment. It's like a non-stop procession of personalized ads in some real sense, and it often is ads. And so that seems to be happening at the expense of these medium to long-term commitments that might be indicative of maturity and adulthood and spirituality, religious orientation, civic duty, all of that.
Social media is a great place to garner unearned social reputation.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be gamed, and it is gamed. And we also even know the nature of the people who game it. There's a whole emergent psychological literature concentrating on dark tetrad traits. So we could walk through that a little bit. So the standard personality models that produce the big five, extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, they were derived sort of with a primitive AI, that's a way of thinking about it, that looked for patterns of description across huge corpuses of linguistic data. How do people talk about each other? It turns out they talk about each other using 5 dimensions, and those are the dimensions I just described. But the people who derived the big five didn't use evaluative descriptors. They threw anything out that looked like a value judgment. So for example, you might say of someone, he's a good person, and you might say of someone else, he's a malevolent person. Those descriptors weren't included in the big five corpus because they were trying to derive a model of normative personality. Okay, so, but that meant that the pathological personality wasn't encapsulated or well-defined. Now, this guy, Robert Hare, who worked at University of British Columbia as world's leading authority on psychopathy, he interviewed hundreds and hundreds of psychopaths and was always fooled by them, by the way. And then he had a student, Del Paulus, who works at UBC, and Paulus developed a model of personality that was based on pathology, like on the dark side. He called that the dark triad. Machiavellianism, that means Machiavellian is someone who, so let's say, if I was Machiavellian in our discussions, what I would have done was think, before I came here, I thought, well, you know, what can Joe offer me? And then I'd think, well, how can I play Joe with my language so I'm most likely to get what I'm, you know, the narrow, impulsive, selfish thing that I'm aiming at right now. So that's how a Machiavellian operates. A narcissist, that's the next part of the dark triad, is someone who wants social status without doing any of the work. They want all the attention. If you're dating a narcissist or in a relationship with a narcissist, they'll alienate all your family members and your friends so that they get all the attention. And that'll just be the first of the games they play with you.
Yeah.
Then you have psychopathy, and the psychopaths are parasitical predators. And so the predator will take whatever you've got, and the parasite will live off you. And then here's a parasitical ideological statement. Property is theft, classic Marxist trope. Why would you say that? Well, if I want to live off you, the way I'm going to justify that ethically is by claiming, well, you know, Joe, look how privileged you are. You've got all this money. You just took that from the oppressed. And if I'm manipulating you so that I get some of your money, that's only just because, first of all, it's exactly what you did. And second of all, well, why not spread some of that wealth around? So that's Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy, dark triad. They've expanded that recently to add another dimension that was missing, sadism. And the sadist takes positive delight in causing pain to others. And the lulz culture, L-U-L-Z, the lulz culture online is a culture of sadistic, Machiavellian, narcissistic psychopaths.
And that wraps up our enlightening discussion with Dr. Bernt Peterson, shedding light on the complex interplay between media, technology, and the human psyche. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with others who may benefit from this perspective. Thank you for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video.
I did it for the lulz, and it's the plural of LOL, laugh out loud, but like if you look at the Urban Dictionary, for example, the definition of lulz is positive delight in the suffering of others. It's like, yeah, it's sadistic. And bloody well, social media just facilitates like that. In and of itself, it's not a sufficient marker, right? You have to have like 6 or 7 things going on before it's clear that you're manifesting this underlying tetrad of personality traits. Like if you use the odd acronym and you're throwing out a joke at someone, this is a habitual pattern of doing nothing but provoking people online and using deception and lies to do it to attract attention to yourself. It has to be a very consistent pattern. But Paulos, first of all, and his crew of researchers and people who've been influenced by him have laid out this 4-dimensional structure of the dark side, let's say. And they've shown that hyper users of social media, Instagram, for example, and people who do a lot of anonymous shit posting are characterized by, what would you call it? Domination by those 4 traits. And part of the reason for that, this is very, very dangerous to our whole society, I think, is that you got to ask yourself what keeps the psychopaths under control in the normal population. And the answer seems to be, especially on the male side, is that narcissistic aggressive men get put in their place by non-narcissistic aggressive men. And that usually has to do with something like the threat of physical intervention. You know how it is if you get a bunch of guys together. I can make a joke about you, and I could even make a joke that was that sort of put you down. But the joke would have to be funny. You'd have to have the opportunity to reciprocate, and you'd have to believe that I was doing it in good spirit. Because if I just used the opportunity to, stick the knife in, we're not going to get along with each other very long. And we know that, and men know that when they talk to each other. And so part of what keeps dialogue among men civilized is the possibility that it won't be civilized if it goes too sideways. And everybody knows that. There is none of that online, because anybody can post anything about anyone, no matter how denigrating and derisive, especially if they do it anonymously, and there's zero consequence. In fact, quite the opposite. If they're good at it, they get a lot of attention, and the social media companies will monetize it. And so not only is it not inhibited, it's actually facilitated. And this isn't a trivial problem, because if the psychopaths multiply enough, they take the whole society out. I think virtualization enables psychopathy. And it's worse than just the trolling bit. That's bad enough because it pollutes political dialogue and it makes everyone think that everything is more unstable than it really is. But online criminality is actually a terrible plague. I don't think there's an old person in North America who isn't being targeted by some gang of psychopaths who's, documented all of their interests and their locale and who knows how much money's in their bank account and who's doing everything they possibly can at every second to leverage access to it. That's just happening continually. They get it in, and some lonely old character who's not functioning cognitively quite like he used to, he gets sucked in by someone pretending to be his friend and offered a great investment opportunity.
Yeah.
And it's very, very, very difficult to track this sort of thing online. So you get the real enabling of the criminals, because how the hell, if they're anonymous, how the hell do you keep them, how do you hold them to account? And then the secondary derivation of that is something like trolling. And that's really not so good either, because if the psychopathic, narcissistic, Machiavellian sadists are dominating the political discourse, then ordinary people look at that and think, oh my God, everything's going to hell.
Sit on your bed one night and say, what's one thing I'm doing wrong, that I know I'm doing wrong, that I could fix, that I would fix? You meditate on that, you'll get an answer. And it won't be one you want, but it'll be the necessary one.
This might sound like an old tale you've heard, but stay with us as we explore its far-fetching implications relating to human psychology, personal goals, facing fear, and the limitless potential within us.
Everyone has this proclivity to some degree as they're deeply self-conscious and uncertain. And so instead of allowing the person they're with to connect with that underlying uncertainty and inadequacy, they act out a persona.
Yeah.
And then the problem is that, well, perhaps the person falls in love with that persona, but there's no real connection there. It's an artifice. And, having said that, one of the things that Carl Jung, the great psychotherapist, said about a persona is, don't be thinking that you're better off if you never formed one. So for Jung, it was a voyage from, say, undifferentiated self in infancy and so forth, through persona to authenticity, because you have to act out your ideals to some degree, right? And you also have to formulate a avatar of yourself in some sense that's a mediator between you and other people in casual social encounters. Like, you don't want to walk into the bank and have the teller tell you about his or her day when you say, "How are you doing?" Right? I mean, now and then that can happen, but generally it's too much intimacy too quickly. And so you need this functional shell. But the problem arises when that functional shell is all that there is. And then the real person underneath is just desperate and unhappy because nothing of what's being acted out reflects a true underlying reality.
What is the consequence, the long-term consequence of acting? So many people, especially because of the world I live in Instagram and social media, we kind of build out these personas, and then we almost follow the implicit instructions that come with those personas.
Well, that's the problem right there, is that, well, that I'm trying to get a hold of the Disney people at the moment because I want to do a lecture series on Pinocchio, because I think Pinocchio is a brilliant work of art. And if you're a puppet and an actor, and Pinocchio is both at times in that movie, both a puppet and an actor. So why an actor? Like, why is there something wrong with being an actor? Well, the first question is, well, who sets your role? And then the second question is, who's pulling your strings? So you've put on this front that is there to make you popular and sexy and desirable and to mask from yourself your own inadequacies. But that's a role. Well, who wrote it? And for what purpose? And so Jung said, for example, that we all acted out a myth, and whether we knew it or not. And maybe you're acting out a tragedy. Maybe you're acting out Narcissus. You don't know, because you've put that on yourself in an attempt, in some ways, to deliver to people what they want, or more accurately, to look as though you're delivering to people what they want. And it's not nothing to do that, right? Because at least you're attempting, in some sense, to adapt to the social world. Someone who's really infantile and dependent, someone who's never left home, part of their problem is that they haven't crafted a persona. So you don't want to denigrate it entirely, but it's no substitute for the real thing. And it turns out that not only is what we want from each other the real thing, but that's also the adventure of your life. And so if you aren't truthful, and that means, unfortunately, especially at the beginning, when you start to be truthful, it means deeply coming to terms with your inadequacies in humility. So it's very painful. Without that, you don't have the adventure of your life. You have the role that you've acquiesced to. And that'll take all the meaning out of your life.
The adventure of your life. You say, imagine who you could be, and then aim single-mindedly at that. I encounter these young people who appear to know who they could be, or they've imagined who they could be, but for whatever reason, they seem to choose the certain misery of their current situation, the job that's sucking their soul out, or that relationship, over the uncertainty they'll encounter as they go on the adventure of their life. So what would I say to these young people who always say to me, Steve, I want to do this, but you can see them stifled by fear, because it's like...
Yeah, well, it's like, make a plan, man. So when I was doing my clinical work, which I did a lot of career work with my clients, both at a beginner level, I would say, like really a beginner level, with people who had no employment whatsoever, no history of employment, who were undereducated and who lacked every skill you could possibly imagine. So these were people who were really in dire straits, up to people who were operating at the top of their profession, but who could still strategize forward. And so, for example, let's say you're at a dead end in your job. Okay, so I don't find my work meaningful. All right, so that's a problem statement. It's like, well, why not? I find the work I do repetitive and boring and without spirit. I have a bad relationship or a neutral relationship with my boss who doesn't know who I am. I have problems with coworkers. All of that needs to be differentiated, right, and analyzed in detail. So we might say, for example, let's say you believe that you're undervalued at work, and maybe you are. What you need to do is you have something to say, and we would have to figure out what it is that you have to say. But it would be some variant of, I'm bringing more value to the table than I'm being compensated for, and that's demoralizing me. And it's also not good for you being my boss, because if I'm actually more valuable than is being recognized, then the fact that you're not valuing me properly means that I will become demoralized, I won't work properly, and you won't get the best out of me. So it's bad for both of us. And if your boss is in principle not amenable to such a discussion, then what you should seriously consider doing is finding another job. Okay, so let's say we're going to set you up for this. Okay, this isn't like next week's enterprise, man. This is your life. So the first thing I would ask is, well, do you have your resume or CV in order? Well, I haven't typed it up for 3 years. Well, what do you think about bringing it up? Well, I'm pretty nervous about that because there's some holes in it. And, I didn't do so well in college and I'm kind of embarrassed about my resume. It's like, okay, bring it in. Let's go through it. Let's at least update it. Let's look where the holes are. Let's look at where the inadequacies are as far as you're concerned, right? This isn't my judgment. It's your judgment. Let's walk through those judgments and see if they're warranted, because maybe you're just too guilty and ashamed and self-conscious and anxious, and you're looking at your resume more critically than someone else would. And maybe there's some holes that you need to rectify. You were 2 courses away from your BA and you dropped out or something like that. Well, maybe we need 6 months to address that. And at least, even if you can't be fully educated, you could be taking some courses online. And so when you went to a new job interview and they said, what about this hole? You'd say, well, I came to terms with that 6 months ago, and in an effort to rectify it, I'm taking the following courses, and here's my plan for completion. That's a really good answer.
What the hell are we going to do without men? You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up, these men, they're doing impossible things. They're under the streets, working on the sewers, they're up on the power lines in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning, this thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death, and often literally, and the gratitude for that is sorely lacking, especially among the people who should be most grateful.
Ever wondered why many men feel directionless? Today, Bernt Peterson reveals the startling truths behind this, a wake-up call that every man should hear.
More than 90% of the people who watch my videos on YouTube are men. Now that's weird because about 80% of psychology students are women. So that is not what you would expect, right? You'd expect that the majority of them would be women. And you might say, well, it's because of the political stance I've taken. And I thought, well, that's possible. So I went and looked at the demographic data because I have that. Well, before I did any of the political videos, 85% of my viewers were men. So it's actually increased a bit. It's increased by 6%. And that's not trivial, but it was still overwhelmingly men. So that was interesting. I thought, what the hell? Why is that exactly? And then now I've been watching crowds when I've been talking to them. And the crowds that have come to see me in person. This happened at the University of Toronto free speech debate. And I actually noticed it and commented on it before the debate took place because I was talking about intrinsic differences between men and women. And I looked around the room and I thought, hey, 80% of the people in this room are men. So I had all the women stand up and then all the men stand up. I said, look, like, here's a natural experiment. For some reason, 80% of the people who showed up to this are men. Now, everybody thought I was kind of cracked to do that. And it was a risk, but I thought, no, there's something going on here. And then what's interesting now is that every public appearance that I've made that's related to the sort of topics that we're discussing is overwhelmingly men. It's like 85 to 90%. And so I thought, wow, that's weird. Like, what the hell's going on here exactly?
In a world constantly changing, many men find themselves at a crossroads. Dr. Peterson sheds light on the deep-rooted reasons, societal shifts, and internal struggles. As we unravel these insights, We'll also seek paths to rediscovery and purpose. This isn't just a talk, it's a roadmap to understanding. Stay with us and let's find the way.
You see university professors, especially of the social justice bent, who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis, making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And it's very useful to tell everyone, not just men, that they have an important role to play, a necessary role, and that if they act properly and honestly and forthrightly, that they can put their lives together and they can help their families and they can make their communities better, and that that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round. And if we had any sense, we'd understand that instead of doing everything at every possible moment to label what we have in the West as oppressive and patriarchal and fundamentally predicated on power, of all the insane propositions.
And what I see happening to young men in particular, boys as well, not just young men, and maybe even, maybe starting at the age of toddlers, is that we have this sense in the world that human beings live in antagonism to nature and that we're actually a malevolent force. And that our social structures, which are clearly capable of the commission of atrocity, are fundamentally oppressive, patriarchal in their nature. And so then if you're a male in a society with that ethos, the motive force that drives you into the world to live is associated with rapaciousness and despoliation on the natural front, and then oppression and atrocity on the social front. It's like, well then, if you're the least bit conscientious, because this sort of accusation hurts conscientious young men the most, then the best you can do is, well, let's say castrate yourself. How would that be? And that would be real comical, except that it's also happening. So I guess that's why I think there's a crisis. And there's something serious at the root of it, right? Because we do have to take the fact of the potential damage we can do to the natural world and the social world. We have to take that seriously, but the proper consequence of taking that seriously is not to commit hara-kiri, let's say, in a fit of moral anxiety and take yourself completely out of the game.
Most of my audiences are young men. It's probably about 65-35. More and more women are showing up, but that's about what it is right now. The halls are dead silent. You could hear a pin drop because nobody's said so clearly for like 50 years that almost all the meaning that you will need to get you through the hard times of your life is going to be a consequence of adopting responsibility, not of rights and impulsive action, impulsive freedom. Like, fine, rights, yeah, got it. Freedom, no problem. Even freedom to do impulsive things, fine. But that isn't where you're going to find the meaning that keeps you sustained through the storms of life. That's going to be, you take care of yourself, you take care of your intimate partner, you take care of your damn family. You don't run off. You take care of your community. You rescue the wisdom from the past. You stand up straight and you be courageous despite the fact that life is tragic and tainted by malevolence. It's like that's ancient wisdom. That's what that is.
And understanding that there's structure and discipline. And that, I am in a lot of ways, both of those things you described earlier. I'm in a lot of ways, my mind I'm creative and I'm always sort of half paying attention to things, but I'm also disciplined.
Yeah, right.
And it's one of the reasons why I think I so relate to both sides of this issue.
For men, there's nothing but responsibility. I was watching The Simpsons the other day. I watched the first Simpsons episode and I deconstructed it. And so it's really interesting. So what happens in the first Simpson episode is that it's Christmas and Homer and Marge are going to buy some Christmas presents, but Homer doesn't get his Christmas bonus. And so he's absolutely crushed by that. And that actually is a recurring theme in The Simpsons, where Homer loses his job or something like that, or can't make enough money. He's completely crushed. Even though he's kind of useless, bumbling, laughing fool of a guy, you know, the thing that gives that show its soul is that he's still oriented towards his family. That's what makes him honorable, is that foolish as he is, he's decided to adopt responsibility for his family and to try to bear that. And so he's a holy fool. He's not a complete fool. And it's so interesting watching the story because he suffers dreadfully as a consequence of not being able to fulfill his responsibility. Well, that's for men. Women have their sets of responsibilities. They're not the same, right? Because they're complicated, because women, of course, have to take primary responsibility for having infants at least, but then also for caring for them. They're structured differently than men. For biological necessity, even if it's not a psychological issue, and it's also partly a psychological issue. Women know what they have to do. Men have to figure out what they have to do. And if they have nothing worth living for, then they stay Peter Pan. And why the hell not? Because the alternative to valued responsibility is impulsive, low-class pleasure. And you saw that in the Pinocchio story, right? That's Pleasure Island. It's like, well, why lift a load if there's nothing in it for you? That's another thing that we're doing to men that's a very bad idea. And to boys. It's like, you're pathological and oppressive. It's like, fine then, why the hell am I going to play? If that's the situation, if I get no credit for bearing responsibility, you can bloody well be sure I'm not going to bear any. But then, you know, your life is useless and meaningless, and you're full of self-contempt and nihilism, and that's not good. And so that's why I think, that's what I think's going on at a deeper level with regards to men needing this direction. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. He has to decide that. They'll eat themselves up unless they have a load. This is why there's such an opiate epidemic among dispossessed, white, middle-aged guys who are unemployed in the US. It's like, they lose their job, they're done, right? They despise themselves. They develop chronic pain syndromes and depression. And the chronic pain is treated with opiates. It's like, that's what we're doing. So, yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Is you have to, and it's so interesting to watch the young men when you talk to them about responsibility. They're so goddamn thrilled about it. It just blows me away. It's like, really? That's the counterculture. Grow the hell up and do something useful. Really? I could do that? Oh, I'm so excited by that idea. No one ever mentioned that before. It's like rights, 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 rights. Jesus, it's appalling. And I feel that that's deeply felt by the people who are coming out to listen to these sorts of things too. They've had enough of that. So, and they better have, because it's a non-productive mode of being. Responsibility, man. That's where the meaning in life is. So.
What advice do you have for a young man in his 20s?
Make a plan. Look at what you're interested in. Get disciplined about something. Allow for the possibility that you have something important to contribute to the world, and that the world would be a lesser place without that contribution. Don't be afraid of taking on responsibility. It's where you find what sustains you in your life. You can take on too much responsibility. You have to be cautious in that regard, but that's a less common problem than not taking on enough. A lot of the things that people regard as traps are actually the means to their life. You know, often young people are afraid of commitment, for example, in the context of a romantic relationship, and because they feel that that's going to interfere with their pursuit of something more valuable. But that's just not the case. You're not going to find something more valuable in your life than a committed relationship with someone that you love, that sustains itself across time, and that in all likelihood produces children. That's life. And there may be people for whom avoiding that is the better route, but those people are very rare, and you need a real reason to assume that you're one of those people. And hopefully for you, you're not.